All right, welcome back, Hilbert Panthers. Today's lesson, lesson 11, long title, Political Developments in the Early Republic. Now, if I was in charge of naming these lessons, this one would be called Washington and Adams Presidencies. And that's what you're going to learn about. We're going to take a look at the first president of the United States, George Washington, and then we're also going to take a look at John Adams. And so we'll get through their presidencies. We'll cover Washington today. The next lesson we'll jump into Adams. All right. So learning targets today. What we want to do is we want to take a look at the successes and the failures of Washington's presidency. He was the first president of the United States. Everything is going to be new. When the founding fathers created the Constitution and they gave the power of the presidency to one person, none of the founding fathers doubted that George Washington would be a great president, would set a great example for others to follow. They were worried about who would come after him. So we're going to take a look at his failures and his successes. And then we're going to take a look at the Whiskey Rebellion, which was the first test of Washington's presidency. So let's get started. So, 1789, and the United States has created a brand new government, the Constitution. And under the Constitution, we now have our first president, George Washington. So we won the American Revolution. The war ended in 1783. And between 1783 and 1789, while we were a young country, there was no president. Washington is our first one. John Adams will be his vice president. Right? He'll also become our second president. But everything is new. For instance, Congress debated for weeks on what to call George Washington. Seriously, they did. His Excellency, that was one of the choices. His Elective Highness, here's my personal favorite right here. His Highness, the President of the United States and Protector of the Rights of the Same. Some people seriously wanted to call him that. And then George Washington simply said, hey, why don't we go with Mr. President? And that's what we went with. And it stuck. Right? Seriously, everything's new. They spent weeks on that. Creating a cabinet. The executive branch has a president, has a vice president. It has a presidential advisors, his cabinet. All right. Today's cabinet has way more members. Well, we have 50 states, right? So we have way more members in our cabinet today. Back then, there were 5. You had the Postmaster General, you had the Attorney General, which is the lawyer for the United States, and you had these 3 gentlemen. These are your more famous members of the cabinet. We'll start with the Secretary of War, Henry Knox. During the American Revolution, Henry Knox was one of Washington's most trusted generals. So he's going to be given the job of overseeing the nation's defenses as Secretary of War. Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. The job of the Secretary of State is to oversee our relations with other countries in the world. We're having a problem with France, send the Secretary of State over to France. We're having a problem with Britain, send him over to Britain. And then that person would report directly to the President. The President can't be everywhere. He needs to delegate authority, and that's what the cabinet does. And then you have the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Thank God for Lin-Manuel Miranda. Alexander Hamilton was one of the most important founding fathers that we had. Unfortunately, he's going to be killed in a duel. And pretty young when that happens. But he was one of our most important founding fathers. George Washington, during the American Revolution, Alexander Hamilton was his personal aide. In the cabinet, he's going to be the Secretary of Treasury. It's going to be his job for our country's economy to get up and running. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. So Washington is president. Country is broke, all right? We need to raise money. We are millions of dollars in debt. Spain helped us in the American Revolution, but it wasn't free. We had to pay them back. France had to pay them back. We had to pay citizens. It was a mess. Now, how does the government make money? They pass taxes. So they finally decided that they are going to pass a tax on whiskey. All right, this is going to cause a huge problem. The farmers that lived west of the Appalachian Mountains, because it took so long to get their crop to market, that they turned their crop into whiskey. And they did this for a number of different reasons. One, it wouldn't spoil. Trying to make that journey over the Appalachian Mountains to all the markets on the coast, the crops would spoil. Turning it into whiskey would prevent that from happening. Two, it's easier to transport. Turn it into whiskey, put it in some containers, and off you go. They would even get more money for the whiskey. And then the last thing is where they lived, they didn't have a lot of money. So what they did was they traded goods with each other. It's called bartering. And guess which one of those goods was a very important trade for tool? Tool for trade. Whiskey. So whiskey, very important to these Western farmers. And now it's being taxed. They don't have a lot of money. They're not happy. This happened all the way from Georgia to Pennsylvania. So a pretty big issue for the new government. And so now this is going to be called the Whiskey Rebellion. Western farmers don't want to pay it. And so what happens is you send these tax collectors out there, they're getting shot at, they're getting tarred and feathered. And I will show you what that is in just a second, but it's a nasty, nasty thing. What they would do is they would take hot tar, pour it over a person's body. Well, now, first of all, that's burning, and that's sticky. That ain't coming off. And then just to make matters worse, they would take feathers and then throw them on the tar, so now the person looks like a giant chicken. All right? It hurts, kind of embarrassing. In 1793, the government lowers the tax. Well, the farmers in Pennsylvania, still not happy, still protesting this thing. And so now you have George Washington, who is personally going to jump on a horse and lead 13,000 soldiers to Pennsylvania. Well, when the Pennsylvania farmers see that, yeah, they're going to pay the tax. So the Whiskey Rebellion ends. This was the first test of George Washington's presidency. Took care of it. And then here's a picture. And you'll see the one gentleman all the way on the far left. He's got a tar, a little spoon with tar. He's dripping it on the one guy, and the other guy's throwing feathers on him. And that's how you would tar and feather someone. All right. French Revolution's going to come along in 1789. And this, right away, Americans said yes. I mean, who was the country that helped us in our American Revolution? The French, right? So Americans are like, hey, we had our revolution, we wanted our own government, let the French have theirs. Until, excuse me, until the new people in charge of the French government start beheading people. And what they're doing is they're beheading nobles, people with money. And why are they beheading them? Just because. 20,000 men, women, and children are going to be beheaded in France. When that happens, you're going to have half Americans saying, oh God, no, we can't support this. They're killing men, women, and children. And then the other half's going to say, hey, in a revolution, people are going to die. So what you have here is Americans are now divided over the French Revolution, which is going to lead to the creation of our first political parties. Okay? And we'll get into that into the next lesson. So Hamilton followers, they can't support the revolution. Hamilton likes Britain. He wants to be just like Britain. Doesn't like France. So he and his followers, nah, we can't support it. Jefferson and his people, some people die in a revolution. It's going to happen. And so the nation is now split on the issue of the French Revolution. And here's how you would behead someone. This is called a guillotine. Person kneels down, puts their head in, and then that sharp blade at the top is released, and the head comes off. And huge crowds would come and watch all of this going on. France was in turmoil. They were a mess. and huge crowds would come to see this. So Washington's presidency, you had the Whiskey Rebellion, you had the French Revolution, you had the economy trying to, get running and all of that. Washington was having trouble with France and Britain. You should know that France and Britain, neither one expected the United States to succeed as a country. They're both waiting for us to fail. And so they did not completely respect us, and Washington had to deal with that. But now Washington has served 2 terms as president, and he's resigning. Right? He's had enough. I mean, he was our commander, he was our leading general in the American Revolution. He became our president. He was president of the Constitutional Convention. The man's tired. He's done enough. He's going to resign. Before he does, he gives a speech to Congress. It's called a farewell address. And in the speech, he warns Americans about 2 things. 1, stay out of the affairs of other countries. Don't let other countries pull the United States into their problems. We're a brand new country. We have enough problems of our own. Let's just handle ourselves. So that's one thing that he warned them about. The second was political parties. They had already started while he was president. Alexander Hamilton, and his followers are going to be called the Federalists. And then Thomas Jefferson and his followers are going to be called Democratic Republicans. We'll shorten that to Republicans. So, I mean, he's warning people stay away from these things, but it's already happening. So now what other things became traditions because of George Washington? Well, giving a farewell address. Every president who hasn't died in office, before they leave office, they give a speech to the nation, a farewell address. They want to say what they've done well for the country, and they want to say what lies ahead for the country. Other traditions that George Washington created that people followed, serving 2 terms. He served 2 terms as president, and then he resigned. And every other president that came after him who was lucky enough to be elected twice resigned after 2, except for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was elected 4 times. After that, we said, wow, that's a little too much, and now there's a constitutional amendment. A person can only serve as president for 2 terms. Creating a cabinet. Washington started it, and every president since then has had a cabinet where they've had a group of advisors advising the president on different matters involving the government. All right. So that's our talk today on the presidency of George Washington. You have your study guide. You got your quiz. And if you have any need for help, the textbook. Use the textbook. Use this PowerPoint presentation. Watch this video again. Do whatever you need to do to be successful, get an A on everything that you're working on. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Have a great day.